The Charlotte Hornets, they lose to the Detroit Pistons for the second time this season. Is this going to be life after Terry Rozier? We'll discuss that, and we'll break down some comments from Jake Fisher, who joined me on Wes and Walker earlier this week. All today, Locked On Hornets.
You are Locked On Hornets, your daily Charlotte Hornets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
In a minute, cuz we live.
It's Locked On Hornets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Thanks for making us your first listen. We're free and available anywhere you get your podcast, and that includes YouTube, where Doug is performing a ceremonious changing of the hat from the Big Dub hat to the 2017 Charlotte All-Star Game hat. That's Doug Branson, a sad Doug Branson. You can find him on his substack, everyhornetsboxscore.com. You can listen to me on WFNZ every weekday from 12 to 3 p.m. We'll get to Doug in a moment, but not before I tell you this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. You can go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That was depressing to see that hat change for you, Doug. How are you feeling?
It's tough out there, to go from beating the best team in the better conference in an amazing fourth quarter to then turning right around and losing to the worst team in the worst conference, and doing so because you had a terrible fourth quarter. It's quite a roller coaster the Charlotte Hornets are on right now, and you do it against the Pistons, who you give them 2 wins towards the Pistons were in line to take away the Bobcat suffering of 7-59, of having the worst record in NBA history. And the Hornets, this brand of Charlotte basketball, has gotten them one step closer to getting out of that hole. It's difficult. It's tough, man. It's brutal to watch.
Yeah, so the Pistons have played 44 games. I mean, they are right there on the line because they have to win 9. And here they are at 5-39. I mean, they are really.
Well, the good news is they're done playing the Hornets. That's it for the series. They win the series 2-1. It's over. They don't get another crack at this team.
Doug, I'll just ask you: Is this what life is going to contain post Terry Rozier? What was it? BT and PT before Terry and post Terry?
Well, that's going to be up to LaMelo Ball and the rest of the veterans on this roster. I mean, it's up to them at this point. Do they want to salvage something this season? They're not going to make the playoffs. They're not going to make the play-in. But they can salvage respectable basketball. And we don't know how this team is going to look post-trade deadline. So it's tough to say. I mean, we're fairly certain LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller are going to be part of this team. But outside of that, how do you look at PJ or Miles and say, well, it's your responsibility? We don't know if those players are going to be on the roster. But it's up to them because it was on this loss was on them. I mean, LaMelo Ball turned in one of his worst outings of the season, 6 of 21 from the field, 1 of 8 from 3, 17.7 assists and 4 rebounds, but he also had 6 personal fouls, had 4 turnovers. In the fourth quarter, it was him and Miles Bridges really reverting to ISO basketball. Brandon Miller had a 20-plus point game, 4 straight 20-plus point game for him, did not take a single shot. Yeah. Because the ball wasn't moving. It was all hero ball, it was all ISO ball, and they embarrassed themselves. And it really shows that win against Minnesota, as much as we celebrated it because we had to, because we needed to. Yeah,
unapologetically so, right? Like it was not some statement. It wasn't some statement that, hey, we're on the rise. We're coming. No. Watch out. It was, we're not going to get many of these. We're going to celebrate and party like it's the only win we'll ever see again.
No, yeah, but even in that win, it was so much about what Minnesota was doing, which is what a few good teams have done with the Hornets this season, is they were messing around. And Detroit came into this game, they're not messing around. And I tried to warn people in my preview yesterday that if you look at the scores for Detroit, you see 2 things. 1, they score a lot, and 2, they are in a lot of close games. They just have not won any of those close games. The Hornets let them get close and let them win. And it's super disheartening, super disappointing.
The one bright spot in all of this continues to be Brandon Miller, who did score 23 points, as you mentioned. He was 5 of 10 from deep, 8 of 17 from the field. Not a great shooting night to start, really. I think he was, 4 of 10, which isn't terrible, but I think it was 4 of 10 at the beginning of this game and then started to hit until you got to the fourth quarter where they only scored 14 points. They were outscored by 10 and then lost, as you mentioned. And so that's what led to the loss, 113-106 against the Detroit Pistons. Yeah, even without Terry Rozier, Doug, I think even still, we all know that can't be an excuse to lose to the worst team in basketball. Even if you don't have Terry, you still do have LaMelo, who played 32 minutes. You still do have Miles Bridges, who played 40. Brandon Miller, you have Asar Thompson, who's a good player on the other side, but he's not Brandon Miller. He's not had a better rookie season than what Brandon Miller has.
He's gotten benched.
And so Brandon Miller is out here also being a better player than the other rookie on the other side, right? Like the only matchup that you would favor, Bogdanovich is a good basketball player. They have a good front court, Beef Stew and Jalen Duren, but I mean it's a terrible basketball team. And so are the Charlotte Hornets, and that's how they lost. And it's frustrating. And this is going to be life after Terry. Like, it's going to be tough, right? Because they lost this game, it doesn't justify those that said they should have never traded Terry. It's not going to be that because we all know the Hornets got worse when they made that trade. Very simple. They got a 2027 first and Kyle Lowry, who probably won't play a single minute for this team. So they got worse. They knew they were going to get worse. But now it's all about, can you put some respect on the core of this team going forward? Can they gain the respect going forward? Because LaMelo Ball, Brandon Miller, and Mark Williams are the guys that you're looking at, and that's what we always mention. But also, if you want to be here, maybe they don't. Maybe some of these players don't. But if these players do want to be here, or at the very least, put out good film so they can try to get more money. Hello, Miles, who's going to be an unrestricted free agent. Gordon Hayward, whenever he comes back, who knows what happens there. But even PJ, if he wants to get traded or if he just wants to be a foundational player here and he comes off the bench and goes 4 of 6, whatever. But you have all of these players that are also playing for something, individual something, but it matters to their career. And yet here they are losing to Detroit. It's going to get bad. It feels like it, at least, in the second half of the season.
So let's talk about the two things that Terry Rozier brought to this team really over the past 2 seasons. One of them is obvious, one of them is not as obvious. The obvious thing that he did was tough shot making, especially in the fourth quarter when it mattered most, whether he was going ISO or in transition or using the pick and roll. He was scoring difficult buckets at opportune times. And so the question is, who is going to step up and replace that? The obvious answer you would think would be LaMelo, and that's going to be the challenge for him moving forward as he takes on this max contract, as he now is handed the keys because there's no one else to have the keys. All right, this is going to be his team moving forward. He's got to step up and take responsibility for that fourth quarter. And the second thing that's not as obvious is Terry Rozier was responsible for a lot of those bench lineups, organizing those bench lineups, playmaking when LaMelo Ball was not on the floor. And that's where this team suffered most before you got to that fourth quarter. The fact that Detroit was in this game was a result of guys being put into position to playmake that shouldn't be playmaking. And I would put Miles Bridges at the top of that category. When Miles Bridges turns it over, boy, does he turn it over with flair, and he does it at the most inopportune times. He's trying to, put passes in very tiny windows and make these electric passes, and he just can't make them. And that's not – it's not something that I don't think he should be expected to do. It shouldn't be his role. But this is life after Terry until they can reorganize this team and get some actual legitimate backup guard help that is not, all due respect to Ish Smith, is not Ish Smith, is not Kyle Lowry, is not the answer. They need a legitimate backup point guard to come in and shepherd these lineups now that Terry Rozier is gone.
I mean, yeah, that was always going to be the problem too. Like if we were just talking about how they were going to look post Terry, then if LaMelo is out, it gets to be a terrible situation for ball handlers. Brandon Miller becomes your best decision maker outside. So it's Ish Smith and it's Brandon Miller. Those are the guys that I trust the most with the basketball in their hands, facilitating and running the offense. And that's not a good position to be in. A guy that was quite literally at the most opposite spectrums of their careers that you could be. Ish Smith, barely still in the league, and Brandon Miller, barely in the league. And those are going to be the guys that you rely on first and foremost, because Frank Ntilikina, he's supposed to be your defender at that position, not your offensive player that is really going to help everybody out. Cody Martin is break glass in case of emergency point guard that you haven't really experimented like that since his rookie season. And you're also going to who else? Nick Smith Jr. He's a scorer, so it's going to be terrible.
Who is going to set the standard on the defensive end? Because the other reason they lost this game is just horrible. Well, two reasons. Horrible pick and roll defense and horrible defense just holding guys at the point of attack. I mean, there were multiple players that were just cooking LaMelo Ball over and over again. And look, maybe it's fitness, maybe it's rhythm. You keep hearing that over and over from Steve Clifford, him getting back from this latest ankle injury. Maybe that's it, and maybe that all gets shored up over time. But it was happening over and over again, and it wasn't just him. It was bad pick and roll defenses that were leading to Bogdanovich wide open 3-point shots, bad communication. Miles Bridges constantly pointing to somebody like, "Hey, where's the talk? Somebody say something." Brandon Miller's out there. You can see him mouthing like, "Talk." Ish Smith, same thing. Talk. Like, where is the communication on this defense? It is non-existent. And there are some of these players that will be part of this organization moving forward. Somebody has to set the standard. Somebody has to take responsibility for the defensive end of the floor, or it's going to be many, many years of misery, not just a few.
All right, let's focus on some other things on the other side. Coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
Don't go to sleep on the Hornets just yet.
Speaking of that future, Jake Fisher. I went fishing yesterday on Wes and Walker, Doug, and I feel like we
got a big one.
Yeah, no, not as in that was the boring trip with your dad. Not a good fishing trip. We didn't catch anything. It was raining the whole time. He got mad at me because I dropped a lure in the water.
Right.
And
it's a teenage. It's growing up. As a kid, you're excited about it. As a teenager, you're like, all right, let me get back to whatever I was doing.
Yeah, I did go fish. I feel like I did catch a big one, but it was almost like the one that got away. I'll explain in the next segment of Locked On Hornets. It was very weird. This episode is brought to you by Grammarly. When it comes to writing, Grammarly is there to support you from start to finish. For over 10 years, Grammarly has been powered by AI technology you can trust to help you across all the places where you write the most. And now Grammarly helps you do even more. With one click, you can easily brainstorm, rewrite, and reply with any suggestions based on your context and goals. And so you can improve productivity for you and your teams. If there's a big presentation coming up, let Grammarly create a personalized outline to get you organized so you can transform your ideas into a compelling presentation. Need to draft an important email and don't know where to start? Grammarly has suggestions to jumpstart your writing. If we need help with the draft, does Grammarly help with the Charlotte Hornets? I would love to know. Maybe we just employ Grammarly as the new GM. The best part is that it's free to use. Start being more productive at work. Go to Grammarly.com/podcast to download for free today. That's Grammarly, Grammarly. Just put grammar, L-Y at the end. Easy. Grammarly.com/podcast. More to come. Locked On Hornets. That was a low feeling first segment. That was bad. That was tough. At the highest of highs against Minnesota, trading Terry Rozier, losing to Detroit. Yeah, it's going to be the exact opposite in the leading segment that is today's episode. So let's focus on at least two positives before we get into some of the Jake Fisher sound. What do you have for us, Doug? Do you have anything positive to talk about?
Yeah, well, I wanted to go back to the Brandon Miller thing. He is hitting shots now that he wasn't taking or hitting earlier in the season. He's hitting shots now off these DHOs, off the quick catch, that you go, how in the world did he hit that shot? And that to me is like one of the first signs of a future All-NBA player, where this guy is just hitting shots and hitting multiple back-to-back shots where you go, okay, he's starting to string things together in a way that jumps off the screen. And I cannot fathom why he did not get a single shot in the fourth quarter. That is, no one will be able to explain that to me sufficiently. The other positive is that the Hornets do get a few players back. Cody Martin was not very active offensively, but the Hornets scored enough to win this game. He was good on the defensive end of the floor. And Nick Richards comes back. It's a career high 21 points. They need somebody's going. It's not going to be one player that takes over Terry Rozier's scoring. It is going to have to be multiple players. And Nick Richards' pre-ankle injury was not active at all offensively. It was pretty clear. And so he's got to be better than that. And he was in this game, and he was physical, one of the few physical players on the floor last night. Big jams, big offensive rebounds. And, Nick Richards, great game.
Well, last point for Brandon on me. You're mentioning how it's not going to be one player that takes over the scoring for Terry Rozier, which you're right, because Terry, especially just in the clutch, everybody's going to have to contribute. You're still right about that. But could it also be true that maybe it is just Brandon Miller? Like if we were to stop right now, or if we were just to start it in the second half, do we see Brandon go from the 15 points per game he's averaging currently? Does he just go to 20? Maybe not the difficulty. The efficiency is going to go down because of law of averages stuff, exactly. Right? So that's what's going to happen. In fact, you could argue he's hitting this many shots because he was in such a cold slump for a while. So the question is, dude played 39 minutes. I wonder if that's the most. It can't be the most, but 39 minutes is more than he's played here recently.
It's so funny.
Is Brandon Miller just going to be the guy that actually does take over the scoring for Terry Rozier? And he played 39 against Miami earlier this year, 39 against Chicago. He did pass 40 in the overtime game against Boston. So that was as much as he's played all year long, basically.
Yeah, and it's probably a result of ramping LaMelo back up, because LaMelo gets 31 in this game. Mm-hmm. You know, you're trying to get to a point where LaMelo is playing, plus 35, which is going to probably take a few minutes away from Miles Bridges, Brandon Miller. You're going to see more LaMelo in those bench lineups that he wasn't a part of in this game that I was just commenting on, that they missed Terry in that respect. But yeah, I mean, obviously in the future, that's Brandon Miller's job now, is to become either the 2 or the 1 for this team moving forward. I think that's going to be an interesting question as we continue to examine this thing.
Even just to be clear, because clearly future, it's maybe number 1. I'm just talking about the next 40 games that they play.
Well, what's funny is that he is playing 39 minutes, and every single game, when Clifford gets a chance to comment on it, he says Brandon Miller's playing too many minutes.
Yeah, I know.
But he's got a choice, so he just throws him out there for 38, 39, whatever. Eventually, that's going to catch up with him.
It is indeed. Okay, let's get to some Jake Fisher. At least we don't have the sound, but we can talk about what he did say to me on Wes and Walker yesterday, and Wes Bryant interviewing him. You can go catch that interview, WFNZ.com. So we threw a lot at him, as you might with somebody that does know a lot about the Charlotte Hornets, is often one to break some news about them. And he was all over the Terry stuff, which a lot of people were starting to discuss Terry to Miami. It became known, but Jake was one of the guys out there also tweeting about it. So we asked him who might be next. What were some of the other moves, and what was the value, the demand for some of these players? So Doug, he spoke about Gordon Hayward and how that's going to be hard to find a suitor for him because of the big contract, which makes sense. Same thing with Kyle Lowry, but who knows? Philadelphia is a team he brought up just because he's from there. He played at Villanova. There's the connection to Daryl Morey with their time at Houston, but it's also what are you going to give up to go get Kyle Lowry that the Hornets would be willing? If you're the Hornets, it's just all about matching salary at that point. So it's still going to be really hard though. He did bring up PJ, and I guess we can start there before we get to the GM question. Does it feel like PJ Washington is the next to go, Doug? Jake did say that he has a lot of value around the league, at least with what he is, right? A lot of value in the sense that, here's somebody valuable on their roster. Here's somebody that could come in and you could connect pretty easily with what his skill set is. He's got a $12 million a year contract. And so while he's not, he's so valuable, he didn't get signed, but he's valuable enough to grease the wheels on a trade a lot easier than trading for Miles, who has right to refusal, Gordon Hayward, who's making over 30 mil, and Kyle Lowry's ghost. So it feels like PJ is the next one in line here.
Yeah, and I think the number on that contract will allow any team to look past any kind of efficiency issues with PJ Washington, any of the offensive struggles that he's had this season, any of the I mean, he had some defensive struggles in this game against Detroit. Like if Terry's weird play against Minnesota was an indicator that he was about to be traded, and I know a lot of people were chattering about PJ changing his like Twitter profile picture. But we always do this though around trade deadline. I'm not going to play this game because people do things and then it ends up.
I like to play it a little bit.
I know you like to play it. I know you like to play it. I do not like to play it because this is what happens. We go down that road and then eventually nothing happens. And then the player says, well, that was just a reference to my favorite movie or something. Like it was just like, I don't want to play this game. But he did, his defense looked a little weird against Detroit. That's all I'm saying. If that was an indicator.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that's my analysis there. But the contract will allow any team, $12 million, that's going to allow any team to look at his play and go, well, we can make excuses for it. He's coming off the bench. His role has changed 1,000,000 times in his tenure with the Charlotte Hornets. Once we get him here into our organization, he's going to have a defined role off the bench as, a scoring threat, and we go. So I think, I think he's the most likely because, again, you don't have to deal with any of the stuff with Miles Bridges being the PR hit, if there is any, and then on top of that, you'll have to deal with unrestricted free agency, and you've got to get him to agree to a trade in the first place.
So the other thing is, Jake didn't say this with us, but he actually joined 7:30 the day prior. So Charlotte, they were hot on the Jake Fisher trail because, of course, this is the guy that will come onto the airwaves and talk about them. He did talk about Nick Richards, how valuable he was, that many teams were interested in a very easily attainable contract at, $5 million just for some big man depth. And the question there is, if the Hornets trade Nick Richards while Mark Williams is still out, then I don't even know if you can do that. Like, I don't even know. You just, okay. All right.
They've been doing it. It's not as if like they've been relying on Nathan Mensah and PJ Washington to play center. They did it for 3 games while Nick Richards was out with the ankle injury. So it's not impossible, but they will lose a lot of games.
The other thing Jake Fisher said, I asked him about potential GM names. If the assumption around the league was that Mitch Kupchak was going to be gone, and that is the assumption. Steve Clifford, Jake said, there's still uncertainty. Okay, but Mitch, I don't think he's going to come back. But with Mitch Kupchak, the assumption is that he's going to be gone. If that is the case, then I asked about some potential names. Jake Fisher didn't necessarily want to say any names because it was a little sensitive, considering that Mitch Kupchak still has that position. He still operates with that title, and we're talking about him no longer being that guy. And he didn't want to inadvertently affect the future at all, right? By saying some of these names out there or whatever. I don't even know.
What is he, time traveling? The butterfly effect? Like, is he going to like...
I mean, I
know Jake Fisher all of a sudden has superpowers now.
You have to understand, this is somebody that is going to operate in a very safe space, or as much as possible, who also hosted a podcast called Please Don't Aggregate This. So he is trying, he is very wary of that, right? If you name the podcast, Please Don't Aggregate This, then I can already understand the angle. Look, okay, just let me say, I know you go off on Jake Fisher. I would like to have him on again. So just please, you do it during a solo episode or something. But with Jake, he was talking about how, like, there are connections to Duke. He didn't want to give me names, but he said there are connections to Duke with some of these guys that might be second in command with their respective franchises. And so, okay, we were trying to do the math on that in the studio. The only connection to Duke and the Atlanta Hawks specifically that I can think of, because you also have that connection with ownership and Rick Schnall, is Danny Ferry. Yeah.
You mean that Danny Ferry? I do mean
that Danny Ferry. So there's that one connection. It's also been Travis Schlenk has been a popular name mentioned that could be that guy because he was also a part of the Hawks while Rick Schnall was there.
I have to explain my reaction at some point on the Danny Ferry thing.
I know. Jeff Peterson is another name that is second in command. He fits that. You check that box off. I don't think you can check that box off for Duke. He played at Arkansas and then eventually finished at Florida State. I think he played at Iowa too. So he transferred a couple times. So those are the names that we come up with. But Danny Ferry, Doug, like, he checks the Hawks and the Duke box off. So you can explain your feelings on that.
Well, so if anyone recalls, Ferry was the president of basketball operations and general manager for the Atlanta Hawks in 2012. And then in 2014, during a conference call about then Miami Heat player Luol Deng, Danny Ferry read aloud verbatim an offensive and racist comment written in a scouting report about Luol Deng. There was a dismissal, and then they took it back, and then there was an investigation. And according to Wikipedia here, an independent investigation reported that Ferry's actions were not motivated by racism, but he eventually reached a buyout agreement with the Hawks. And then last we heard, he was a consultant with the Spurs as of 2020. So that would be an interesting hire, particularly for a franchise that I feel like has been dealing with a lot of like having to explain things. Like I don't even know if this is necessarily about whether or not Ferry did anything wrong, and more about just like why would you invite that into your franchise after having dealt with so much with the Miles Bridges situation and then James Bouknight and on and on and on. Like this is a team that has constantly been on the PR defensive. That would be an interesting move. But if we're taking these clues and saying, well, the Duke connection is Danny Ferry is connected with Jeff Peterson because Peterson was involved with Ferry and Schlenk in Atlanta. Schlenk also obviously serving under Danny Ferry as well. Maybe that's just all of the, if I'm the Charlie Day from, what's the meme from It's Always Sunny, like I've got a cigarette in my finger and I'm pointing to, I've got the board up with all the newspaper clippings and the red tie. If I'm making all those connections, I think we still fall back on the two names that Fisher has talked about previously. Like, I'm fine if he doesn't want to talk about it now, but he's mentioned these guys' names in previous reports. Peterson, Schlenk, those being the names.
That's right.
I don't think it's Ferry. I just think it's those two guys, and it's down to those two.
Yeah, that would be the thing. So you're right about that. Yeah, he has mentioned before, like it was not breaking news if he were to say Schlenk and Peterson on the radio show, but those are the names that he's mentioned before. And so we just have no clue, but it was just a weird way to answer it.
Right.
Again, you can go check that interview out on WFNZ.com because he did have a lot to say about a bunch of different stuff, Hornets-wise. Final comments?
But to be fair to Jake, he has to be careful because if he reveals too much, then the Germans will have won World War II, and it'll be just a complete alt fiction, narrative, and we'll all be speaking German.
All right, let's move on. Last segment coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast.
Don't go to sleep on the Hornets just yet.
You don't mess around with time travel. That's all I'm saying. I mean, if I've watched enough alt history, that's what it teaches you over and over. Do not mess around with time travel.
Does it matter if the GM lies to the fan base? We discuss that coming up next in the last segment.
Yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and then you can watch the winnings roll in. With the basketball season here, of course, halfway through, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball with the Specials League, and it's a league created specifically for combo projections that includes 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and doesn't return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. This episode is also brought to you by Hungry Root. Hungry Root is the easiest way to get fresh, high-quality food delivered to your door. They've got healthy groceries and simple recipes all in one place. You can take a fun short quiz, and Hungry Root will get to know you, your goals, and how you like to eat. They'll ask what flavors you like, which kitchen appliances you use, and even more than that. And then they'll keep your needs and preferences top of mind and start building your cart with delicious recipes and all your grocery needs for the week. Hungry Root will recommend recipes and groceries based on your taste, take their suggestions, or choose anything you want. They've got fresh produce, high-quality meat and seafood, pantry staples, healthy snacks and sweets, much more than that as well. You'll spend less time meal planning, shopping, and cooking, and more time enjoying healthy food that you'll actually love with Hungry Root. Right now, Hungry Root is offering Locked On NBA listeners 40% off your first delivery and free veggies for life. Free veggies for life. It always feels like that's a crazy offer, but Hungry Root is doing it. Just go to hungryroot.com/lockedon to get 40% off your first delivery and get your free veggies. That's hungryroot.com/lockedon. Don't forget to use our link so they know that we sent you. More Locked On Hornets ahead. So, Doug, we have heard from Mitch Kupchak after the Terry Rozier trade. He spoke to media, I think it was 2 days ago after the Terry Rozier trade. He spoke with media later that night about 6:30, and he talked about the direction of the franchise. He was asked about the direction of the franchise. He was asked about a potential rebuild. And Mitch Kupchak told you, me, and the entire Hornets fan base that it wasn't a rebuild.
Don't believe your eyes.
A rebuild is when you start from scratch. And they don't feel like they're starting from scratch, that they have a couple of pieces in place that they are going to keep that are a part of the foundation. Do you feel like Mitch Kupchak was lying to everybody? And does it matter if you do think he was lying to everybody?
Well, I talked about this extensively. I think my thoughts on this are clear if you want to go back to the last episode and check that out if you missed those thoughts. I don't think he was out and out lying. I just don't think he wants to confront the truth and reveal that truth to everyone. But this is obviously, I mean, you just look at last night. This is obviously a rebuild. I do think, but first I want to hear your thoughts, but then I want to tell you where he did actually tell a very honest truth. I think he accidentally stumbled into an honest truth, and it's kind of a sad truth, but it is. He did tell the truth boldly and honestly. In one particular part, but I want to hear your thoughts on just that whole press conference in general.
Well, like the thing about the whole rebuild, retool stuff, we've gone through this with the Hornets before. We've gone through this with the Carolina Panthers. I hate this kind of talk because it all boils down to semantics and what it truly is to undergo a rebuild. It's all about like what you're arguing so often in these discussions is what a rebuild truly is. If you have a different definition of what a rebuild is in your mind, then you're going to argue with somebody else who has a different definition, and there are so many different definitions of it. Like, that's what I hate. So every fan is saying, oh, this isn't a rebuild, it's more of a retooling. And then that's the next, right? Like, we have the different stages of the rebuild convo. We have different stages of grief. You go from what is a rebuild? No, it's not. It's more of a retool. You get to the retool stage. Here's what I think. I do think that Mitch Kupchak, for whatever you want to define rebuild, I do understand his point about if you are undergoing a complete rebuild, that means you're trading everybody. Nobody's safe. Not one player is safe. And we see that. You see teams undergo the true, straight up, we're tanking, and we are not going to keep any of the people on our roster, and we're going to trade them all for draft picks. But they're not going to do that with LaMelo. They're going to keep him. They're not going to do that with Brandon Miller. They're going to keep him. They're not going to do that, in my opinion, with Mark Williams. So I do understand his point about not wanting to start from scratch and therefore it not being a complete rebuild. Like, I do think there's something to be said if you are keeping 60% of a starting five that's already on this roster, right? Like, if you are fully healthy, then what would become your starting five would be what? Terry Rozier and Miles Bridges, who aren't a part of this in future discussions, and maybe Miles is, but we can get to that later. But then it's Mark, Brandon Miller, and LaMelo. Like, that's what you have in your mind. And so if you're keeping 60% of it, I get where he's coming from. Like, I understand where he's saying we're not building from scratch, and so it's not a complete rebuild. And I know people got really frustrated about that. But I just, like, it's all about how you define it. And I can't do the rebuild, the retool. What does it mean anymore? Because I've done that a lot since 2017. And I can't do it anymore with Mitch Kupchak just giving you what his definition of a rebuild is.
That's fine. We won't do that. But I think Nada texted me after my show yesterday, after he listened to the show, and said, what is it? Essentially, he said, like, what does it matter? Is it really important that, or would it change anything if Mitch Kupchak had come out and just told everyone the truth? And I'll say this. I think it is important. I don't think it's important for Mitch at this point because this franchise will move on from Mitch Kupchak at some point. So I don't think it's really that important for him at this moment in time to tell the bold and honest truth. But I do think at some point they need to bring in management that will do that for the fan base, because doing that signals that you as a front office understand what the problem is, and you cannot solve a problem unless you understand what the problem is and you're willing to admit that. And I think fans would relish that if someone came in and said, look, here's what the deal is, here's what the problem has been, and here's how we're going to fix it. I think more fans would tune in for that than they would tune in for somebody that's saying, no, this is not a rebuild. This team is capable of making the playoffs, when it's obvious that they haven't been for the past couple of seasons. He did tell the truth in one particular location in this press conference. Would you like to hear where it was?
I can't wait what you think the truth is here.
So someone asked him if Terry Rozier was involved in this trade, if Terry Rozier pushed Mitch Kupchak to make this deal. And here's what Mitch Kupchak said. Terry never came to me and said he wanted to be traded. Truth be told, I think every veteran, as they approach 30, doesn't want to go through a season where you're not going to have an impact in the playoffs. And I think if you asked him, he would show great remorse in leaving Charlotte and be very nostalgic, at least he was this morning. But I think he'd also say, hey, listen, I'm getting to be 30 years old, and this is a chance for me to do something in the playoffs, okay? So I think that's the way to answer that question.
But no, he's dead on, right? Like, I don't think you could have been more accurate in depicting Terry Rozier's and somebody in a very similar situation's feelings.
And that is a brutal truth. That is a brutal truth to admit that, hey, we're going to trade this guy to Miami because there's literally zero shot of him achieving playoffs or success with this team. And so we have to move him to another team where he can do that. Because like, if you sort of peel back that layer to one more layer, because of the decisions or indecisions of this front office and ownership group, previous and, the current one now holds this. Because of that, this team is not capable right now of making the playoffs. So it's brutal truth.
I feel like when we talk
now I can see why he doesn't want to say it. Because saying it makes it very sad.
Well, so like when we're talking about the people part of this business, that whole thing, where is it right to do a solid for the player? Like, just show them that quote. Hey, don't pay attention to all the other stuff that the Hornets have had the reputation of. Like, just look at this one. Mitch understands how hard it is, and he's going to be the bad guy for you and trade you to go to. Because, like, it's not like Mitch is going to use this first round pick, and he's got to know that. And so, I would think he knows that. All right, that'll do it for Locked On Hornets. Thanks for making us your first listen. We're free and available anywhere you get your podcast, and that includes YouTube. I will be back tomorrow. Doug is going to take the day off. He's got some other things to do. He's got a kid, fruit salad, yummy, yummy, all that stuff. And especially after Detroit.
That's a good time to take a day off.
It is. So I'm going to pick up the slack, and I will be doing just a solo episode tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll be back with you to preview the weekend and continue to give you my thoughts on Terry Rozier.